Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you on the 5th meeting in the series of Redirecting East Conversations. This is a beginning of a new series of residencies, meaning that actually from the beginning of July we are hosting another group of artists, researchers, curators coming from the regions of the that is spanning between something that is called Eastern Europe and something that is called Middle East. And we are here to try to find whether this definition of Easternness can bring us together to the interesting subjects, topics that we would like to work on together. And for today's conversation, I'm very happy to introduce Nazlı Gürlek and Öztat, who will have first the conversation together, and then I hope that they will open it also for our audience. And we have another person in this conversation, another woman, Zishan, that will be the guide that will help us to weave as the narrative between the past and the present. So I will not tell more. I just invite you to start your conversation.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm Nazlı, and she is Iz. And as Anna said, this is going to be a talk about some of the issues of modern era and contemporary Turkey. Thank you. Well, actually, I should say some of the issues that relate with the artistic and cultural production from the late Ottoman era up until today. And it's going to be sort of a loose analysis of some of the issues that are appropriation and reproduction. And so I would like to begin with a very brief introduction on Zishan, on this historical figure, who is a marginal and feminist intellectual who produced many photographs, photomontages, collages, and written works, but nevertheless has always remained invisible, thus never made it into the pages of official art history. And for Iz, she's nothing but a channel spirit and an alter ego instead. She was born in Istanbul in 1894 and lived in Turkey until about 1915, when she went to Europe fleeing from the Armenian genocide. She worked as a photographer in Berlin and got involved with the artists of the movement that was soon to be recognized as Berlin Dada. This is actually a small bit of the biographical information that I got to know through Iz, and this bit of information we will be revealing a lot more soon. But even this bit of information has nurtured my passion to dig deeper into possible alternative paths throughout the Turkish social and artistic histories. Well, actually, as opposed to what we are educated with, what we are presented with by mainstream media, party politics, and official history. So, shall we start from your motivation behind, your interest in the work of Zishan?
I first want to thank everyone for coming, and the talk will be looping on itself, and sometimes the information that's not accessible at the moment we'll come back to it again, and hopefully it will reveal itself more completely at the end of the talk. And I want to start by saying one of the main motivations behind my interest in Zishan at this particular historical moment is the AKP government, the current conservative government in Turkey, is very interested in constructing the Ottoman past in serving its own benefits, as we will speak about more further. And Zishan enables us to peek into an Ottoman past that gives us clues of an anarchist and feminist presence that we didn't know that existed, and it enables us to think of and imagine the future in different ways.
So what we are seeing here now is a work that is found from Zishan's archive, which is entitled Declaration of Women's Gang. Maybe would you like to talk a little bit about this piece here?
Yes. It was actually found in a magazine called The Woman's Path that was published in 1925, and it's published by a group of women who first tried to create a party of women in 1923, but they weren't able to have a political party because at the time women couldn't even vote until 1934. So in this feminist magazine that was published in the from 1925 to 1927, there's a very specific feminist approach where they encourage women to work for the nation and send their children to the army to serve the nation. So it's a very statist and conservative, moralist feminism that is perpetuated. And women's gang, which as we find out later Zishan is part of, suggests another feminism that is more anarchic and put these pamphlets into copies of the magazine. So as 4 copies were found in an ephemera shop, we found out about this guerrilla action that was done in 1925. And the document is in Ottoman, which is the alphabet that was used until 1928 in Turkey, and as we'll speak later, the alphabet gets changed. And some of the suggestions in the declaration are being a wife and a mother are neither commands of nature nor sacred duties. Compulsory conscription should be abolished and children should not be granted to the nation. Faith in morals and the nation do not free women. Instead, they instrumentalize women for societal stability. Ethnic nationalism is not patriotism. Political rights cannot be gained by voting or entering the parliament in a single-party regime. Education should contribute to personal freedom and will instead of the motherland and nation. And what's interesting about the declaration is some of these still hold quite important in the current situation. I mean, the compulsory military service is still happening, and many, even though there are many conscientious objectors and people bringing this up, it still is a mandatory service for all the young men. And also, ethnic nationalism is very much a defining factor in the political sphere. So, and even even the group's very anarchic statement that even voting is not the path to democracy, it's not enough, is quite significant still today, I think.
Yeah. Was she somehow involved with any other anarcho actions of the sort?
Well, after she leaves Turkey in 1915, following the Armenian genocide, she spent some time in Berlin and gets involved in, again, in some anti-conscription campaigns. And during her time in Spain, which didn't enter the World War I and was relatively free of the tensions of the time, she spent time in Murcia and Barcelona, and this sketch for an anti-conscription poster was done there with a group of women, and it says, "Why be their slave when you can be ours? Do not enlist." So it suggests a group of women asking young men to be their slaves instead of going and serving in the military.
How do you see all this work in the context of today's arts and politics?
Well, departing from these two works, first of all, they aren't produced in an artistic context. We are very accustomed now to produce and practice within given context, but she never identifies as an artist, and she never shows her work or publishes her writing with her own name. So she always uses pseudonyms and chooses to be somehow anonymous. And we will refer to what has been happening in Turkey in a very in a little while. But when there are uprisings all around the world against neoliberal agendas and profit-driven politics, I think this demand for this desire to carry artistic production and interventions outside of given artistic spaces is quite relevant. And also that her practice is somehow has distributed authorship, and like anyone could claim the name Women's Gang and become part of it and produce under this name. So it also enables for a collective production that is all somehow anonymous.
This anonymous spirit behind these works actually reminds me of the spirit, the anonymous spirit that is behind the action, the protests, the ongoing protests in Istanbul, which started by a small group of environmentalists at the end of, on the 31st of May, this last May, and they're still ongoing. And they actually expanded in all over the country with no centralized leadership of sorts. And as you may probably know, these protests are for the freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and the government's encroachment on Turkish secularism and Erdogan's authoritarianism. This is a visual, a picture of that anonymous and collective spirit that we had in the park, which led actually these protests, which soon expanded to all these different places. But how about the issue of collectiveness in the context of art? How do you see it, and how does it resonate with you, with your own work as an artist? Perhaps you can comment on that, elaborating on your choice of bringing together your own work with the work of Zishan, which starts with you finding her archive and actually exhibiting her work next along your own work in your exhibitions.
Well, working with Zishan and collaborating with her enables me to articulate a very specific relationship to time and the self. And I want to quote a few people here to orient you a bit in how I relate to her. I want to quote Deleuze and Guattari from Thousand Plateaus. They say, the two of us, Deleuze and Guattari, wrote Anti-Oedipus together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. We have been aided, inspired, multiplied, including by future philosophers, writers, artists, and scientists. So I think in any kind of production, there is always these loops, these relationships to the past and the future, and we are always, you can call this inspiration, or references, but ultimately we are dependent on production of others that come before us and after us. And that is how I see my working with Zishan. Somehow maybe her work was already produced for me to carry on, or I need to make her work relevant now. So there's some sense of channeling involved, and I feel like I channel her and bring out what was relevant in her work for today and for imagining an alternative future. And I also want to quote from Klossowski about Nietzsche's vicious circle. The vicious circle, as eternal return, is presented as a chain of existence that forms the individuality of the doctrines adherent. Who knows that he has pre-existed otherwise than he now exists, and that he will yet exist differently from one eternity to another. So although these ideas are very vague and very difficult to grasp with a rational approach, I like thinking about the self as a place where we forget the self and open up place for the others, and thus multiply the self and think of it as a more complicated relationship that involves very much remembering, forgetting, and channeling and embodying various possibilities.
Perhaps the work that exemplifies best what you mean by untimely collaboration is the one that is titled Posthumous Production Series Inherited Weights, which you chose to title 1928 to 2012. Can you talk a little bit about this work instead?
Okay, before I get to the work, I'll give you a brief background to contextualize it. Now we are at the middle of 19th century, and I just want to mention how Ottoman Empire, how artistic production in the Western sense started in the Ottoman Empire. So up to the middle of 19th century, there's no art production in the Western sense in the Ottoman Empire. And the first perspective classes and drawing classes are introduced in the military schools to aid the militaristic aims. And some of these soldiers who get this education in the military schools continue and are sent to mostly France and Europe to be educated in the fine arts faculties in the West. And they come back always bringing what is already passé. So the people who were sent in the 1910s come back with Impressionism. The people who were sent in the 1920s come back with Cubism. So it's always coming back with the academic notions of the academic notions of art production and bringing that back to the country. And none of them intersects with the avant-garde. So in that sense, it is, Zishan is a very unique figure that goes abroad and gets associated with the avant-garde. And one of the reasons for this may be that she learns the craft of photography at a early age from her Armenian father, who is a photographer. And most of her visual production is done using collage and black and white photography. So maybe not being educated as a painter also enables her to get in touch with the avant-garde of the time. And here on the left, we see a collage from 1928. And actually, the image at the back behind the turban and the pumpkin is a test strip that was a test print from Claude Cahun's photograph belonging to the series called Don't Kiss Me, I'm in Training. And probably through her relationship with Claude Cahun, she gets the test strip and collages it with two images. I mean, the turban and the pumpkin are very similar in form, and the turban is very much a symbol that is accessible to the Oriental gaze at the time. And collaging it with the pumpkin, I guess, opens up a very absurd and surreal field of associations. And on the right, you see one of the works that belong to the posthumous production. I found it necessary to produce most of the posthumous production series. The works that I do in reference to Zishan's works are three-dimensional and sculptural works. And I like working in this way because I am very much interested in the relationship between the document, which comes out of the archive, the autonomous artwork, knowledge production, and materiality and the physicality of things. So in this case, the image is modeled three-dimensionally and printed with a 3D printer with polyamide. So actually, it is a process that is used to produce prototypes for future designs. And it was interesting for me to use a process that involves no hands and very much a machine oriented production process that suggests a future functionality for the objects.
Or perhaps we can talk first about the Circle of Eternal Return, which
and,
you prefer.
And there is, this is another work where I base a posthumous work on a drawing by her. The drawing you see on the left is actually accompanying a utopic story written by Zishan, and the utopia is set on this island called Paradise and Possessed. Actually, the word you see is an Ottoman word, because in Ottoman you don't use the vowels, so there is C, N, and T here, and the word can be read both as Cennet and Cinnet, which means either paradise or possessed. So this island could actually suggest a paradise, or it could suggest a hell. And on this island, everybody makes their own handcrafted time machines called Circle of Eternal Return. And she actually she starts the story in 1915, but the drawings belong to her time in Barcelona. And we know that in this time, many avant-garde figures are based in Barcelona, people escaping from the First World War. And since we found in her archive a copy of Francis Picabia's magazine called 391, where we see the first examples of these irrational machines that you might be more familiar from Duchamp's work. In these drawings, there's a reference, I think, or influence from these primitive machines and the anti-utopian thinking that is involved in the production that she comes across at the time. And then she goes on to Murcia and stays with a group in a village where people are working with esparto grass. So she spends a lot of time working with the material, and that we find out from her writing, but don't have examples of this actually. So I was interested in collaborating with a craftsman, and the material is a timeless material. It still exists. The material is still used in Spain. So I was able to work with a craftsman and reimagine the object and go through similar processes that she went through. And it also draws attention to something that is that's a very important part of her character, her interest in the animistic potential of things, and very much on hands-on and material processes and what can be gained and learned from the relationship with the material.
So let's perhaps elaborate a little bit on the issue of appropriation, which is actually an important one in Turkish artistic and cultural histories. Throughout the modernist era, up until the beginning of the 2000s, there has been no international art collection in Turkey, and with no real option to travel to see the originals. So artists relied very much on reproduction in books. Very few who could travel abroad in the late Ottoman era of the 19th century up until the first years of the Republican era, as is just talked a little bit before, were those that were sent to Europe and especially to Paris to learn the style and the technique of the Western masters in order to then teach them to their peers and students on their return. And they actually, as again is said, they always follow the movements with 20 to 40 years of delay, almost, more or less. So, for example, when Cubism was a relevant avant-garde in the first years of the century, Turkish painters, known as the D group, Group D, appropriated the style as mere form and filled it in with folkloristic content in the late 1950s. And later on, a generation of conceptually oriented artists, such as Serkan Özkaya, tackled the issue of appropriation and produced work which actually critically questioned the issue. This one here is a double the size golden replica of Michelangelo's David, which is originally in the Museum of the Academy of Fine Arts of Florence. and it was made in 2005 for the 9th Istanbul Biennial, but then as it was being erected in its temporary place in the Shishane Square in Istanbul, it just fell down and broke, so it never got to be exhibited in Turkey. And I would actually make a little jump to the architectural the appropriation in the architectural context, and this, what you see here is the original, the historic military barracks, which used to be in Taksim Square, in the grounds of Gezi Park, where all those protests started. This was there from the beginning of the 19th century until 1940. And AKP now, the ruling party AKP, they currently have plans to replace the park, and it got demolished in 1940, and they built a park at its place instead. And now AKP has plans to replace the park with a replica of this original historic building. But the replica will concern only the facade of the building, and inside there will be a shopping mall, a city museum, and some private residencies and restaurants. This is a computer rendering of the new plan, which is probably going to be built quite soon, although we have been protesting against it. They actually have larger plans to reshape the square where the park is located next to, and the square is a project of the Republic. Let me see. No. The square is a project of the Republic, and reshaping it meets their construction, the parties, the ruling parties, the government's construction frenzy and profit maximization, actually. The barracks are a late Ottoman building and an important architectural self-representation of the late empire through the imagined vision of the West. Because, as you can see, there are these turban-like domes on top of this Ottoman-style neoclassic building. One of the first outputs of AKP's such reproductive endeavors was Miniatürk, which was, this is a project which was realized in Istanbul in 2003, and it's still in place. It's actually a miniature park which contains models of historic buildings and sites from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in the Mediterranean Anatolia to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and many others. So our relationship with the past is actually a very contested issue, as well as with cultural heritage. I will have a little bit of a theoretical question to you is about this. What was your starting point in dealing with the past and the heritage?
I will start with a quote that might be very familiar to many of you from George Orwell's 1984. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Even though you want to have a vision oriented to the future, we all know that the past is always ideologically used and shaped by any power, and I guess it depends on how you want to relate to the past and maneuver it for your own ideological reasons. So I'll give an example of how the past is reshaped ideologically and also approached as a load to be gotten rid of, and suggest how I relate to it afterwards. And I also realized that this obsession with history and the past, which I was in 2 museums today, I can very much see it here, everywhere, I guess it's part of the baggage of the nation state and human beings. We are animals that remember, and since we remember, it is very important to work on how we remember, both by the ruling powers and also at a subjective and personal level. So I want to go to an example again, a historical example. Here on the left we see Atatürk, who is the the starter of the Turkish Republic. He built the Republic in 1923, and one of the first reforms he did was a reform in the alphabet. So he got rid of the Ottoman alphabet that you saw in a few images before and brought the Latin alphabet instead. And even though this was claimed to increase the number of people who are literate, it was actually a very symbolic act that broke the relationship with the Ottoman past. So all the documents that were written before 1928 with the Ottoman script became inaccessible to all the generations afterwards, and this was a very abrupt and quick shift. And it also was a secularization and westernization attempt, because the Arabic script is also the religious script, so it was a break with the Islamic past, and also choosing to use the Latin alphabets were an alliance with the West. And here on the right we see a work by Aydan Murtezaoğlu produced between 1992 and 1993, very much in reference to this photograph that is ingrained in every child's memory in Turkey. And it is interesting that it took until the 1990s for artists to become critical of the ideology of the Republic, that these reforms became things that we can question and reflect upon, that these were actually very abrupt changes and ruptures and erasures that were performed on the relationship with the history. And here I want to come back to a work and suggest heritage and history as a source instead of a burden that needs to be socially engineered and gotten rid of. On the left we see a historic document that is from 1919, and it is from a journal called Kurtuluş, and it was the first published journal that had a socialist perspective. It is published by Turkish Workers and Peasants Party.
And Kurtuluş means the name of the journal. It means in English independence.
And it might be difficult to see, but there is only one word that is written in the document with Latin letters. Here you can see utopia. All the rest is written in Ottoman script, and one word is in Latin alphabet, which the word is written in Latin because at that moment it doesn't have a word that is referring to the concept in the Ottoman language yet.
And you responded to it by using the word utopia in your own work.
Yes, so we can, this is yet another work from the posthumous production series. This document was part of Zishan's archive, and very similar to how all this script that is inaccessible to us becomes a pattern. I just used the cane webbing as a pattern and put the word utopia into it as the only single recognizable form. And at the back of the work, there's actually aspartographs coming out, and when you look at the work from one side, you can recognize the word utopia, but when you go to the other side of the work, it just becomes a wild garden where the word becomes unreadable, and it is, for me, a reference to how history gets erased and gets rendered unreadable and inaccessible.
Perhaps a right term to think through history could be parallelism. I'm having in mind a recent exhibition which took place at SALT in Istanbul. It was titled Istanbul, Eindhoven, Salt Vanabe, Modern Times. And it questioned actually the issue of parallel modernisms, bringing together a selection of works from the Vanabe Museum's collection from the beginning of the 20th century until 1960s, along with corresponding works from the same period in Turkey. I think this. I believe that this is actually one of the symptoms of a collectively felt necessity to rewrite and reinterpret our own common history. A few artists today make work which is concerned with archives, which relate to the past through archives. And one of them is actually the founder of Banu Cennetoğlu, who is an artist herself, and who's also the founder of an independent publishing house called BAS. She has recently found the archive of an actor and self-taught artist called Masist Gül, and she actually reprinted Masist Gül's books that were produced back in the 1970s. And another artist, Tayfun Serttaş, he also works with archives in a different way. Actually, he reworked in this exhibition that was titled Foto Galatasaray. He reworked the archive of an Armenian female photographer called Meryem Şahinyan, who had a studio in Galatasaray for like 50 years. But which was then forgotten. Her studio was, after her death, her work was largely forgotten and the studio closed down. But your elaboration of Zişan's archive, it differs from both these two approaches. Because not only because actually you sort of invented not only the archives, but also the objects within it, but as well as the persona of Zişan. So can you elaborate on why you chose to invent instead of reworking already existing material?
Well, I mean, as we have been speaking about it, archives shape our political imagination. So inventing a lineage and work that I can refer to, which I need and that enables me to imagine a different future is quite empowering to me. So in this sense, Zişan's invented archive brings me to another future, and this burden of history becomes actually a source through what I can imagine there once was there. And I also realized something along the way as I worked with the archive. Most of the objects and documents coming out of the archive are very much marked by the media of their time. So she has many letters in the archive and diary writings and telegraphs. And also there's a lot of talk now about how all these uprisings and movements of dissent take place through the use of new media. So I actually am very interested in how, although we find archives, what are the potentials and new media that can open these archives up and puts them in circulation. So I want to come back to where we started and just share an experiment that I did. The work at the very beginning, the Declaration of Women's Gang, it has never been shown at an art context yet. But actually when it was completed, I shared it on Facebook and 628 people shared it. And then over time, in the last 2 years, I started coming across the document in different magazines and links, so it actually became part of the official history. And just like my need to have a different past than the known and the formal one, I actually realized that many people long for this past and pick up on an alternative narrative. And it is very interesting how we can use new media and reshape our relationship to archives.
And also, yeah, and also to self-organize, because this image was shared for 628 times on Facebook, and it was liked like for 68 times. So we all know that the virtual world of the social media is a great way of self-organizing, and it actually proved to be highly effective recently in the among the people who wanted to show their support and to go out on the street to resist and protest. Okay, so this is it for now, and we can now open it to your questions and comments if there are any. Thank you very much.
Shall I? Does anybody have any questions, comments, remarks? Would like to add something to this conversation? No? I have. I have a question. I would like to ask you about this, like something that you finished with, like need to have a different past, like this idea of creating a private subjective genealogy that still can be kind of shared through rework and create an alternative towards the official narrative. And I would like to ask you how in your like both critical, curatorial and artistic practice, those one of the most rigid forms of modernizations that happened in history of Turkey with forming of the Republic, with the idea of like this appropriated modernization in terms of visual arts language work. How do you refer to it, like in your own private art history, like those like incompatible kind of moves?
Well, actually, I mean, I'm a curator, and the work of the artists, they're always the ones that lead me through the history, and also in my own search of alternative paths through it. So I would say the work and the word of the artist is quite important in establishing those alternatives, I believe.
Maybe a small note on how art criticism has been shaped might be important in this. As you have seen from the examples mostly Nazlı showed, that most of the art production up until the 1960s is appropriation of Western styles. And since this is the case, and since all of this notion of Western art is brought from top to bottom, like many other things in the country, there is no critique and articulation of it, because the language is very unfamiliar. For example, many of the words that are used for artistic production are translated from French, because we don't have the practice, we don't have the words for it. And also, we still don't have much art criticism in Turkey. So also the writing of the artistic canon only happens in the 90s. So all the criticism and art writing about these modern movements and production is very limited, and only recently, since the 90s, alternative histories started to be written, and it is also an interesting subject for artistic production. Personally, I'm very interested in working with the history of art in Turkey, and that in relation to histories of art in the West. And these are all new areas of articulation. This didn't exist, so we are in the process of writing of our art history. I think this it's very familiar example would be here for after the fall of the wall. So all the Eastern European art history writing, and it's becoming visible more through the collections and forming a memory of it. These are all attempts that are happening since the 90s, and it is very similar in Turkey. This rewriting of art history and alternative readings for it.
I don't know if this is already a proper moment, but since there weren't no more questions, I would like to just observe that we've got these guests here who just came from this place where the battle is on, and I just wanted to find out what is the relation between the art scene or the artists, curators, critics, the general art scene, and what is going on currently in Istanbul.
Well, actually, I should say that it was a real shock, and it was a real shock for everyone, but also for artists and curators and all those other cultural actors that are working and shaping the actual art scene. And I should say that we are all thinking about our own work and trying to make decisions and trying to actually critically think about our own work in relation to what just happened and change things that don't work, but also trying to find ways in which to relate to what is really actually happening out on the streets in the daily life of all of us in the context of art, and asking whether it's even possible, or if it's not possible, we don't know. We're just questioning all these. We're just asking all these questions. But one thing that has emerged so far, which is, I think, significant, is that the production. This is a collectively. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if you share it or not, but I think you do, because we talked about this a lot. There is a collectively felt necessity to be or remain more anonymous, and to take actions that are more anonymous, and to work on collective goals that are that can be sometimes, and most of the times, done only by remaining anonymous.
Personally, it was very much an existential crisis for me as an artist, and I realized it, and I could see it for many people happening around, me, because with all the movement and how the energy just peaked and exploded by itself, there was a lot of humor and artistic production that is done anonymously that was shaping it and pushing it forward. And all of this was not done by artists and was done anonymously. So all the work that we have been doing in institutions and all the careers we have been building and all the claims we have been doing in terms of culture became quite irrelevant. And I think it is, and many artists and many people from the scene were there with what they could do. So we were constructing barricades, carrying stones, giving food. This is how you participate in such a moment. And I think that was very a good challenge for many of us to experience. And having spoken about a work that is very much oriented to the past, I feel very lucky to experience such a moment that suggests a potential, quite different future, and experiencing it at the moment makes me realize maybe our gaze shouldn't be so much geared to the past, and having lived such an incredible moment, maybe I don't need to construct a past that is different, because I already have a present that can suggest an alternative future.
Somebody needs a microphone? Okay.
Thank you. And it's really, Turkey became a center of interest of the world with this protest. And as you said, it was such a process of enthusiastic, big energy. And for me, it's interesting. In the logic of neoliberalism, it was very logical that such protest happened because the expansion, commercial expansion, and how do you think need some kind of institutionalization of this process, or it should be like a spontaneous, or how to keep this energy and passionality, and how use this energy for further development, and can the artists and curators participate in such processes?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it's significant that I talk a little bit about what happened after, because the protests actually, as they started to happen at the end of May, they just ended now because nobody wants violence other than the police, it seems. So people are now, all the people that are resisting, they're being more cautious. And instead of, there are these forums that are being held almost every night at 9 p.m. in different parks, in smaller parks, because we can't get into the Gezi Park in this large park anymore, because it's taken by the police and guarded by the police. But people are gathering in smaller parks and discussing what happened and how there can be any continuation and to real effects, real political effects and change, if there are gonna be any. So that's a form of self-organization which is not institutionalized at all. It is working so far, but it is a long and a challenging process that will go on for a little longer. And I think it's even a little too soon to say, like, even talk about it in concrete terms, because it's in progress and it's going to be a longer process than maybe expected even.
I mean, your question was exactly the question that so many people were asking once all the people were pushed out of the park. And there are two tendencies. One is about start a political party or transform all this energy into real politics. And the other tendency is this was already a horizontal and spontaneous uprising, and that it should be allowed to take its forms. And exactly as Nazlı said, there are forums happening all around, and this energy is channeling itself into ways and articulating dialogues that never existed before. So even though it seems very abstract and inarticulate at the moment, I find it very exciting that these new forms of dialogue and experiments in democracy are taking place, and it will eventually articulate itself, maybe not in real politics, but definitely as a chemical transformation in the society.
Yeah, my question is to Nazlı. Coming back to the question of appropriation, I would love to hear some considerations on what is appropriated besides stylistic or formal innovations, let's say. Do you consider any other appropriated elements from the mentioned movements? For example, yeah.
Well, the thing is, it could be, what was appropriated could be Cubism, the formal qualities of Cubism without really its theoretical content, but it could also be Impressionism, it could not really Surrealism, don't know why, but it wasn't a real hit.
That was my question about the radical elements of avant-garde, for example, appropriated radicalism, let's put in general.
Not really the radical elements of the avant-garde, no. Dada, actually, a generation of artists which were really active in the 90s, which started to be active in the 90s, which still are, they have, but I wouldn't really call it appropriation. They produced work which is closer in both in form and content to the works of Dada artists. So they were getting closer to that mindset, but it wasn't, I wouldn't mention it as an appropriation because it was different. It was more of a felt and inner necessity even to produce in that way.
Can I also say something about this? Maybe some of the work that is produced at the beginning of 2000s, like works coming from the periphery and challenging the closeness of Western canon, could be some examples. For example, Şener Özmen and Erkan's work. Like there's a video work that is called The Road to Tate Modern. And there are two people that they are referring to Don Quixote, Sancho, and they are on the Kurdish landscape and they are speaking in Kurdish, and they ask a man passing by, where is Tate Modern? So this idea of the periphery never being able to enter the Western canon, and many works from the periphery like this have been produced in the 2000s. So in a sense, these are appropriation of Western references to make a critique of how closed the Western canon is. It's not necessarily appropriation in style, but in appropriation of accessible references to make the West realize how closed its canon is to the peripheries, maybe.
So the next conclusive question is: did you mean the parallel modernisms as this in frames, in this stylistic formal frames?
No,
like,
no. I mean, what I mean by parallel modernisms is that every country has its own process of modernism, and it's not one, and it can't even ever be one for all the globe, for all the geographical contexts that exist. So it is Turkey has its own modernism, and Poland has its own, and they run parallel to each other, and there can be connections between each other, which are not always maybe simultaneous or in the chronological sense. Yeah.
In this case, I wonder what common element do you consider in this universal element? Do you consider, if any, in these modernisms? Why they are?
I can't really say it because I'm not an expert of those other modernisms. I'm eager to discover what you went through in your own country, what people here in Poland went through here. I'm here to discover that, but I can't really make any comments on it right now.
Thank you.
I have a question to the artist. I'm very curious, why did you decide, or why did you choose to reveal that Zishan is indeed an invention of you, and under what conditions do you make this revelation?
I really appreciate that you use the word revelation, because actually she herself is the revelation that came to me through channeling, and I like playing with her, like being potentially real, and then at a more irrational level as as a channeled spirit. So I don't like to approach any reality from one single perspective. So I don't want to be explaining her only in terms of rational reasoning, because possibly she could be a spirit that I'm channeling, and she's revealing all this work to me that she has done, and I just reinvented the material. Maybe it did exist, and it just comes back to me. So I really can't say she didn't really exist. So I insist on the ambiguity. Also, there is this ghostly element about her. She has many qualities of what has been suppressed in Turkey. She escapes from the Armenian genocide. It might not be resonating here with anybody except you, but this Armenian genocide is a fact of history that Turkey keeps denying, and it's impossible to speak about. So she's actually a spirit, a ghost that emerges because it has been silenced, and there are many qualities about her of this suppressed past, and so I also see her really as a ghost that comes back and haunts, and I insist that I cannot rationally explain her existence, and there needs to be more to her presence.
It's a very nice answer, and I would like to follow up with a question. how would you describe your relation or your relationship with Zishan? Would you say that you are some kind of ghost hunter or medium or mediator or translator, or how would you describe that? Or interpreter?
So maybe I can just briefly say how I started this work. I actually, since I started studying art, I have been fascinated with Claude Cahun's work. She's a French photographer and writer who was born in 1894 in France. And most of her life she produced privately, and her archive has been recovered after the 1970s. And her work has been written into the art history canon after the 90s with the performative gender theories. So having so obsessed with her production and seeing how she gets written into history, I slowly arrived at Zishan. And really, after many years with Claude, I actually started going to mediums and asking for Claude Cahun to come. And that process with mediums brought me back. Then I made this object that is the portal, and slowly Zishan started coming. And like Nietzsche's notion of eternal return, it's very complicated for me to articulate more elaborately at this moment here. But all these references of really coexistence of different times and references and I find it very rich, and I like to refer to her as a historical figure, as a channeled spirit and alter ego. These are also three different cosmological approaches and reference frameworks, and we all have, there are many cosmologies and relationships to the world, and I think as artists we should insist on more than just one framework for reality. And this is how I do it for myself.
I'm quite intrigued by the reference that you bring, which is like a current reference about what's happening in Taksim Square, and how historically that's Erdogan used kind of slogan or facade they want to cross their plan. And it seems to me like most of the artists and most of the creators more or less use the same strategies as the politicians. If you consider your delivery of the project successful, what's the lesson has Erdogan to learn from you to get across with his plan to rebuild the facade of old Barak, but actually is kind of a strategy which is covering up or using this Barak or historical elements to get across his plan. So what the question is, what's the difference between politician strategies and curators as well as artist strategies?
Well, I believe the curators and the artists, I wouldn't call it a strategy for what the curators and the artists do, but they simply, if they tackle the issue, I believe it's simply in order to question it, in order to question what is really happening in our lives because the politicians are doing it. So yeah, critically questioning the issue, I would say. That's what the artists and curators do in the context of art.
So, thank you very much for the inspiration.
Thank you.
I think it will continue. Okay. And for the presentation and inviting Zishan here.
Thanks.
So, thank you very much.